In 1770, Captain James Cook was sailing up the east coast of a continent Europeans had barely charted when he looked toward the horizon and did something he almost never did. He gave a landmark a name that wasn't a tribute, wasn't a king, wasn't a patron. He called it a warning. Not because of what he saw on the mountain, but because of what kept happening to ships near it. Vessels were being wrecked, again and again, along a stretch of coastline that, on paper, should have been safe. Cook never explained exactly why. He just marked his charts, sailed on, and left behind a name that has outlived every explanation anyone has offered for it. 2.5 centuries later, this mountain is still doing strange things. Compasses spin near its summit. It is scientifically the first point on the Australian mainland to catch the sunrise every single morning, a geographic fact that shouldn't be possible given its location. And yet it is. And the people who lived beside it for tens of thousands of years before Cook ever saw it had already declared it forbidden. This is the story of Wollumbin Mount Warning, and why, from the ocean to the summit, it has never quite obeyed the rules. If you're new here, this channel is dedicated to uncovering the ancient history, geological mysteries, and forbidden places hidden across the world, starting right here in Australia. We dig past the myths to find out what's actually true, and it's often stranger than the legend. Subscribe now, because this is only the beginning of the story. Wollumbin, known on modern maps as Mount Warning, rises 1,157 metres above the far north coast of New South Wales, its peak often wreathed in a collar of cloud that clings to the summit long after the surrounding valleys have burned off into clear morning light. From a distance, it looks almost impossibly deliberate, a jagged, near-symmetrical spike thrusting up out of a wide, gently curving landscape of green hills that ripple outward from its base for nearly 40 kilometres in every direction. That curve is not an accident. Wollumbin is the eroded plug of an enormous shield volcano that was active around 23 million years ago, one of the largest volcanic centres the Australian continent has ever produced. What remains today is essentially the volcano's throat, the hardened core of magma, that once fed an edifice so vast it would have dwarfed anything else on the continent, since eroded away by 20 million years of rain, wind and river systems carving the surrounding caldera into the fertile Tweed Valley. The rock itself is a rare, coarse-grained volcanic type that cools slowly enough to form crystals visible to the naked eye, giving the summit its jagged, almost armoured texture. Rainforest climbs its lower slopes in dense, ancient layers Antarctic beech trees, whose lineage stretches back to when Australia was still fused to the supercontinent Gondwana, moss-covered boulders, and mist that rolls through the canopy even at midday. Geologists consider the entire Tweed volcano region one of the most significant erosion caldera landscapes on Earth, and due to nothing more than raw geometry, the mountain's height, its easterly position, and the curvature of the horizon Wollumbin's peak, is the first point on the Australian mainland to receive direct sunlight each day. A place forged in fire, worn down by water, and now the very first thing on an entire continent to greet the sun. Long before that geological history had a name, the Bundjalung people of the Tweed Valley already understood this mountain differently, not as a rock formation, but as a being with rules. Wollumbin, in Bundjalung language, is generally understood to mean something close to cloudcatcher or weathermaker, a name tied directly to the way storms gather and break around its peak before rolling across the valley below. For the Bundjalung and neighbouring nations, the mountain sits at the centre of a deep and layered creation narrative, one that identifies it as a place of male ceremonial significance, sacred, restricted, and never meant to be climbed casually or without cultural authority. Access to the summit was traditionally governed by law, tied to specific rights and specific people, and the surrounding country was treated as a place demanding caution and respect rather than recreation. Elders have spoken of Wollumbin as a site connected to lore, to the movement of ancestral beings across the landscape, and to consequences for those who disturbed it without right. It was not framed as a place of random malevolence. The language used was closer to responsibility than fear, a boundary rather than a curse. What's striking is how consistently that boundary was reinforced across generations, long before there was any recorded settler history of accidents on the mountain. When European surveyors and later bushwalkers began climbing Wollumbin in the 20th century, Bundjalung custodians repeatedly and publicly stated that the summit should not be climbed, citing both cultural lore and the physical danger of the place, a warning that ran in parallel with, but independent of, whatever Cook meant when he named it 2 centuries earlier. In late 2020, after decades of advocacy, the summit walking track was permanently closed by the National Park Authority in consultation with Bundjalung custodians, formally restoring the mountain status as a place not meant to be climbed at all. That closure came only after a long and sobering record of what actually happened on the mountain, once people started ignoring the warning. The incidents span nearly 2 centuries, and they follow an unsettling pattern. In the 1800s, sailors along this stretch of coast reported repeated unexplained wrecks in conditions that, by all normal seafaring logic, should have been survivable part of why Cook's original name stuck long after friendlier alternatives were proposed. In the 20th century, as recreational bushwalking on the mountain grew popular, search and rescue call-outs became a near constant feature of the local record. Hikers, often experienced ones, would report sudden and total compass malfunction near the summit needles spinning uselessly, pointing in directions that made no sense relative to known landmarks, leaving people disoriented on terrain where a wrong turn meant a sheer drop through rainforest canopy. Some walkers described losing hours of daylight without realizing it, emerging from what felt like a short detour to find the sun already low in the sky. Search and rescue crews from the local rural fire service and state emergency service units were called to the mountain with striking regularity, often for people who had done everything, correctly checked the weather, carried supplies, started early, and still became lost within a landscape barely 40 kilometres wide. In more recent decades, several fatalities were recorded on the steep. Chain-assisted final ascent to the summit, where wet volcanic rock becomes treacherously slick within minutes of rain, and rain here can arrive with almost no warning at all. By the 2010s, the closure debate had become urgent for safety reasons as much as cultural ones, with mounting injuries and a handful of deaths cited directly in the case for shutting the track for good. Rangers who worked the mountain for decades described a strange consistency to the call-outs, not reckless tourists ignoring signage, but capable, prepared people who simply lost their bearings in a landscape that, on a clear day, looks almost impossible to get lost in. Several rescues involved walkers found only a few hundred metres from the marked track, disoriented in dense cloud that had rolled in with no warning, unable to tell which direction led back down. Local emergency services began treating Wollumbin as a standing risk on their calendar, bracing for call-outs whenever forecasts predicted the kind of fast-moving subtropical weather the region is known for. If you're waiting for the moment this turns supernatural for aliens, energy vortexes, or something ripped from a paranormal file, keep watching. Because what investigators and geologists actually found is stranger and far more grounded than any of that. Subscribe now, because the real explanation changes how you'll see every cursed mountain story you've ever heard. Naturally, a mountain with compass failures, repeated shipwrecks nearby, and a name like Mount Warning became fertile ground for exactly the kind of theories you'd expect. Local rumour and later online forums linked Wollumbin to claims of magnetic vortexes, UFO sightings tied to its status as a supposed energy centre, and comparisons to the Bermuda Triangle, framing the mountain as a kind of Australian anomaly zone where the normal laws of navigation simply broke down. Some of these claims gained traction because they contained a kernel of real. Measurable phenomena compasses genuinely do behave erratically near the summit, and that fact alone was enough for speculation to run well ahead of explanation. But when geologists, park rangers, and historians examined the record systematically, the supernatural framing collapsed under its own weight. The shipwrecks Cook responded to in 1770 were re-examined by maritime historians and matched neatly to a genuinely hazardous stretch of reef and current near Point Danger and Fingal Head, entirely explicable through ordinary navigational hazard rather than any force emanating from the mountain itself. The disorientation reported by hikers, meanwhile, was cross-referenced against search and rescue logs, and a clear pattern emerged. Incidents clustered heavily around specific weather conditions, sudden fog, rapid cloud cover, and afternoon storms, rather than any fixed, mysterious hot zone on the mountain. And the compass anomalies, rather than pointing to some unexplained energy field, turned out to have a precise physical cause once instruments were brought in to actually measure it. Researchers surveying the region with proper magnetometers, rather than handheld hiking compasses, were able to map the anomalies directly, confirming that the effect was localized, measurable, and entirely consistent with known geology, not the diffuse. Sweeping energy field the rumour mill had imagined, but a set of discrete magnetic pockets tied precisely to where certain volcanic rock formations sat closest to the surface. That cause is the volcanic rock itself. Wollumbin's summit is composed largely of rhyolite and, more critically, patches of naturally magnetised basalt rock that cooled millions of years ago, while aligning with the Earth's magnetic field at the time, effectively locking in a compass-scrambling magnetic signature that has nothing to do with any modern electronics and everything to do with volcanic chemistry. Standard hiking compasses, which rely on a freely rotating needle responding only to Earth's overall field, can be overwhelmed by these localized magnetic pockets, producing exactly the spinning, directionless readings hikers described for over a century. Combine that with genuinely severe and fast-changing terrain, a summit ridge, exposed to sudden subtropical storms. Slick volcanic rock on a near-vertical final chain-assisted climb, and dense rainforest canopy that can disorient even careful walkers within minutes, and you get a mountain that is dangerous not because of any curse, but because of an unusually potent combination of real, physical hazards, unreliable navigation instruments, unstable footing, and weather that can turn in the time it takes to reach the summit and look back down. The Bundjalung law that restricted access to this place for millennia wasn't superstition running ahead of science. It was an accurate, culturally encoded risk assessment arrived at through generations of observation that modern geology and search and rescue statistics have now simply confirmed in different language. What makes Wollumbin so compelling isn't that it defies explanation, it's that every layer of explanation, when you actually dig into it, agrees with the one that came before it. Bundjalung law identified this as a place demanding restraint, centuries before Cook gave it a name born from disaster. Cook's warning, born from shipwrecks, turns out to trace back to real hazards in the surrounding waters, and the eerie compass failures that fueled decades of paranormal speculation trace back to nothing more mysterious than magnetised volcanic rock, doing exactly what magnetised rock does. Science didn't debunk the ancient warning here it arrived, centuries later, at the same conclusion by a different road. Wollumbin remains closed to climbers today, not because of legend, but because the mountain that broke every scientific rule turned out to be following its own, all along. If you've stood at the base of a place like this, or if your own culture has a mountain, a valley, or a stretch of coast the elders warned you never to enter, tell us about it in the comments. And if you want more stories where ancient warning and modern science collide, subscribe, because we're only getting started.